good afternoon, everybody. It's really a privilege to be here. My name is Chris Sartorius. I'm from the University of Oklahoma. I work in the David L. Boren College of International Studies, and it's really great to be here. And I really want to thank Anita and Mike for inviting me. They've always been super gracious. I've had a chance to come and speak at these Education Week events the last 3 years or so. This is my 3rd year here, so I do appreciate their very kind invitation. And they do such great work administering the education program here at Fort Sill. And I've known Anita for a super long time and Mike for a long time. I think 11 probably plus years by now. So they're real truly professional folks here that are trying to really work hard to advance education for the Army here at Fort Sill, dedicated to what they're doing. And it's really fantastic to be here to represent the University of Oklahoma. So today I'm going to talk about a really very interesting intelligence and special operations mission that the Israeli Air Force and IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and the Mossad conducted to rescue a very large number of hostages that were taken in a famous Palestinian hostage-taking hijacking operation in the Middle East in 1976. And so it's a fascinating story. There's certainly an element of really good integration of intelligence and operational planning. The tactical execution of this mission was brilliant. So we're going to talk about all those different elements, for sure, the key players, what are some of the long-term strategic consequences of this in terms of special operations when it comes to hostage rescue operations, and then what are some of the geopolitical issues that were in play. So we'll definitely talk about the aftermath of this case. Mike, next slide, please, sir. Thank you for being here. This is really great to see everybody. So this is how the presentation is organized. We're going to talk initially about the historical context, what was happening in the mid-1970s in terms of terrorism against Israel, and then also a little bit of just the general background, the contours of this case. So as we move from general to more specific details, you've got a framework of exactly what's happened. We'll definitely talk about the key players in terms of the hostages themselves that were rescued, the Palestinian and German terrorists that were involved in this, and then also, very importantly, the key leaders from the Israeli Defense Force at the most senior level of their military, as well as the tactical leaders on the ground in Entebbe, Uganda, when this operation was actually executed in 1976. Then we're going to move into the hijacking itself, what were the sequence of events during the hijacking, what were the motivations of the hijackers, their demands, and then we'll talk about what the rescue planning types of options were that the Israeli government considered under consultation, of course, with the Israeli Defense Minister and the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. And then we'll move into how the mission was actually executed versus how it was planned. And then finally talk about the aftermath, the impact on Israel, on basically counter-terrorism forces, the development of counter-terrorism forces moving beyond 1976, what that meant for the region down in southeastern Africa and East Central Africa, as well as for the Israeli government, and then just evaluate the case just in general. So that's the overall framework of the presentation today. And what I'll try to do is limit the talk to about 45 minutes, and then we'll also have a good 15-minute or so period for some discussion and any questions and answers that you might have. We have about a dozen or so folks online, so we've got a really good group, so should have some really good, hopefully robust discussion and Q&A at the end of the presentation. All right, next slide please, Mike. All right, so this right here is just a little bit of some of the background in terms of some of the terrorist activity that really influenced the Israelis' decision to actually, basically embark upon this rescue mission. So in May of 1972, there was an aircraft from Sabena Airlines, the state carrier for Belgium, that was hijacked and actually landed at the Lod Airfield. So this is the present-day Ben Gurion Airfield right outside of Tel Aviv. And so this was an aircraft hijacking in which the Israeli Defense Forces they have a special unit that they had created for counter-terrorism types of operations and hostage rescue missions. And Ehud Barak, famous person, as a young person, was actually the commander of this rescue mission, and they're actually able to kill the 2 male Palestinian terrorists, and also they captured the 2 female terrorists involved in this. So this was a very successful counterterrorism mission that involved hostages on this Belgian airliner that was flying from Brussels to Vienna. And then we also have the Lod Airport massacre. This is where we had a situation where Palestinian terrorists opened fire on a group of tourists that were in the airport there in Tel Aviv. and killed 25, 26 Christians that were actually traveling from Puerto Rico to the Holy Land. And then the Munich Olympic massacre, we have 11 Israeli athletes that are killed, 2 initially in that attack, and then 9 subsequently at the Fürstenfeldbruck airfield right outside of Munich. And the Germans, the German police tried to launch a unsuccessful operation to actually free these hostages that resulted in the massacre of these 9 Israelis. 2 were killed in the initial assault. And then we have the Malat High School massacre, in which about 25 or so people were killed at a high school during a failed rescue attempt. 22 of those 25 were high school age children. So these are some of the events, successes and failures that influenced the Israeli military as they were entering into the 1976 crisis with the hijacked airliner that we're going to talk about in this case study. When it comes to Israeli counterterrorism operations, we also have the Operation Wrath of God and the Spring of Youth. These were operations that were conducted in 1973. The first one by the Mossad to very systematically track, hunt down, and execute through targeted killing operations of key leaders within the Black September terrorist movement that were responsible for the 1972 Munich massacre. And then the Operation Spring of Youth, this resulted in the deaths of 4 senior-level Palestinian terrorists during an Israeli Defense Force operation with the heavy support of Mossad intelligence in Beirut, Lebanon in 1973. And then we have the Yom Kippur War of 1973, one of the major wars in kind of the modern state of Israel's history. Those wars were the 1948 War of Independence, then the 56 Suez Crisis, the 67 Six-Day War, and then finally the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So these are some of the events that are certainly influencing this period of Israeli foreign and defense policy by the time we get to this hijacking in 1976. Please, next slide. All right, so this is just an overview of the hijacking. We're going to talk about this in really extreme detail here in just a few minutes. But this basically occurs over about an 8-day period between the 27th of June. This is when this airliner is actually hijacked. It's a flight, Air France A300, that's flying from Tel Aviv, the Lod Airport, via Athens, Greece, to Paris. And this hijacking is resolved on the 4th of July, 1976, which just by chance happens to be our bicentennial here in the United States. So the Queen of England had taken a cruise to the United States on the royal yacht, and so there were a lot of celebrations for sure in the United States because of our bicentennial, but that's just a fate of historical chance. In terms of the locations involved here, this flight actually takes off in Tel Aviv, Israel, and stops to pick up passengers in actually in Athens, Greece. And then the the terrorists on this flight divert the aircraft to Benghazi. Muammar Gaddafi is the leader of Libya at this point. He's very sympathetic to Palestinian hostage takers, Palestinian terrorists in general. And so they actually divert the aircraft to Benghazi for refueling. And then they fly on to Entebbe, Uganda, which is the airport that's located right outside the capital of Uganda, just about anywhere from 15 to 30 miles, really 30 miles from the center of the capital. But right on Lake Victoria is where the Entebbe airfield is located, and Kampala is actually the capital of Uganda. And then eventually this aircraft, or these hostages are actually going to be taken to Nairobi, Kenya, as part of our story. So this is Air France Flight 139. It's an A300 flight, and the terrorists are from 2 different groups. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, external operations. This is a splinter group from the PFLP. And then there's also terrorists involved from a left-leaning Marxist terrorist group out of Germany called the Revolutionary Cells. Next slide, please. Right, this is just a map I've incorporated in the presentation just so you can kind of see the route of flight, from Tel Aviv and right on the coast of Israel and central Israel all the way up to Athens. There was certainly a certain number of passengers that got off the plane in Athens, and another group of passengers actually came on the aircraft in Athens. This is somewhat of a little bit of a security problem because Athens airport is known to have very poor security. So even the passengers that were on the plane were very concerned about this stopover in Athens. And this is actually where 4 of the terrorists actually board the aircraft in Athens. They know that security is fairly tight at the Lod airport based on this history of terrorism within Israel. So the 2 Germans and the 2 Palestinian terrorists actually board the aircraft along with 58 other passengers in Athens. And then they fly to Benghazi up on the northern coast of Libya, right on the Mediterranean, for refueling. They spend about 24 hours in Libya and then fly down to right the airport right outside of Kampala that you see here just on Lake Victoria, right down here in Uganda. Next slide, please. So this is the aircraft. This is a wide-body aircraft, the A300. So there's a large number of passengers. There's 12 crew members on this aircraft, including the 4 terrorists as well. So that's what just an Air France A300 Airbus type of aircraft looks like. Next slide. So these are the key leaders here. The Prime Minister is Yitzhak Rabin. He's from the Labour Party. Shimon Peres is the Defense Minister, and then Yitzhak Hopi is the Mossad Director. And Yitzhak Rabin is famous. He's one of the heroes of all these various different wars that Israel has fought, from the 1948 War of Independence all the way up through the 1973 Yom Kippur War. He was formerly the chief of the Israeli Defense Forces, 4-star general, so a full military career within the Israeli Defense Forces. And then Shimon Peres also spent his career as a civilian in the Israeli Defense Ministry. So these are some of the key leaders on the Israeli government side. Next slide, please. Okay, these are the military leaders that are involved in our story here. We have the IDF Chief of Staff, General Gur, and then also we've got General Kuti, who's actually the Director of Operations. He's important because he's the one who's actually going to brief the Israeli cabinet on the military planning for this operation. The Director of Intelligence is there. The Israeli Chief of Staff is General Peled. He's actually on board the command and control aircraft during this operation, a Boeing 707 that's flying over Kenya when this operation is going down later on in our story. And then in terms of people who are on the ground, actually at the Entebbe airfield, it's the final 3 people on the slide. So Operation Thunderbolt is the name of this military operation. There's Brigadier General Shamron, who's actually set up a command post between the new and the old terminal, and I have a map to better explain that. And then Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu. You probably recognize that name because the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, this is his older brother. He's actually the commander of the Israeli Special Operations Force that's actually going to storm this terminal to rescue the hostages. And then finally, the aircraft commander of the lead aircraft, which is a C-130, kind of our first aircraft that's on the ground in Entebbe, is Lieutenant Colonel Shani. Next slide, please. So these are the hostages here. There's Air France Flight 139. It departs with 228 passengers initially out of the Lod Airport, Tel Aviv, with 12 crew members. All the crew members are French citizens except for one. There's a Scandinavian lady that's one of the stewardesses. 38 passengers disembark in Athens, and then they pick up 56 passengers, including the 4 terrorists in Athens. So at this point, there's a total of 246 passengers plus 12 crew members on the aircraft. Next slide, please. These are the terrorists. There's 2 PFLP external operations. I haven't been able to track down their true names. These are people who actually boarded the aircraft in Athens. They're referred to in the kind of the reading and research I've done as the Peruvian, and then the terrorist with the yellow shirt. And then the Revolutionary Cells terrorist is a man named Wilfried Böse, and then Brigitte Kuhlmann. Those are the 2 German terrorists that are involved in this. And then there's also 3, these final 3 on the slide here they actually meet these terrorists once the plane lands actually at Entebbe. Wadi Haddad is the overall arch kind of commander of this, and he's actually possibly in Uganda during this operation. That hasn't really been confirmed, but the Israelis believe that when they make some phone calls with the president of Uganda, Idi Amin, that actually Wadi Haddad is actually in Uganda working closely with the president, Idi Amin, during this operation. But he definitely he's not captured or killed at any point during this operation. Next slide, please. All right, this is kind of a little bit some of the chronology of events dealing with the hijacking itself. On day one, obviously, the aircraft departs. It goes to Benghazi for this refueling operation, and then flies down on day two down to Entebbe, lands there by mid-afternoon. The hostages are actually taken off the airplane. There's a new terminal complex with a north-south runway over on the west side of this airfield, and this aircraft is actually taken to the old terminal building. It's very much derelict, and so they actually are held in the main hall of the old terminal building, and all that happens on day two. By day three, the terrorists have actually announced their demands. They want a $5 million payment from the French government for the return of the Airbus A300. And they also want 40 Palestinians in Israeli jails released, as well as 13 prisoners from 5 different countries. And some of these terrorists are actually coming from Germany, and thus the inclusion of the German terrorists in this operation. The German terrorists, are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and these 40 Palestinians in Israeli jails, that was a very common demand for a lot of the various different Palestinian terrorists in this era of terrorism in Israel in the 1970s. And the deadline for this is 1 July at 1200 Zulu. Should the Israelis fail to deliver the release of these prisoners in Israeli jails, the threat is death to the various hostages, from the aircraft that they take over. Next slide, please. So the old terminals, on day three, this is very disconcerting to the hostages. They're separated into 2 groups. One group are all the non-Israeli hostages, which is the bulk of the hostages, and then there's 83 hostages that are Israeli citizens. And the way they identify these folks is during this hostage crisis, all the passengers for that matter, are actually asked to place their passports and their identity documents into a bag, and then the terrorists basically just administratively separate out who has Israeli citizenship and who does not. And so in the main hallway is where the bulk of these passengers are being held, but there's actually a separate room in the airport where they basically place all the Israeli citizens. And so there are several of these passengers who actually are Jewish, but they might be from Belgium and have Belgian citizenship. There's an American Orthodox Jewish couple, for example, and those folks are not put in the Israeli citizen group, but rather the larger group that's held in the main hall. So the government at this point is asking the Israeli Defense Forces and the Mossad, hey, are there viable military options to free these hostages? And at this point in time in this crisis, the military says no, there are not really good military options. So reluctantly, the government Yitzhak Rabin actually decides to negotiate with the terrorists, and they announced that, and that's a huge break in policy, because under Golda Meir, the previous prime minister, the policy had been, hey, there will be no negotiating with these terrorists, period. And so the prime minister very reluctantly agrees to start negotiations. So he sends a delegation of Israelis to Paris, and that's really the center of these negotiations. But one of the stipulations is we're never going to release Palestinians from Israeli jails that have Israeli blood on their hands. So the Palestinians have given a list of names to the Israeli government, and the Israeli government's position is we're going to select the 40 terrorists, the 40 prisoners in jails, not the Palestinians. So they're at loggerheads on these negotiations. And this is not a delaying tactic at this time. I mean, the Prime Minister's directions is we're going to negotiate in earnest because we have no other choice at this point in time. So this is not a play for time at this point. So the terrorists extend the negotiating deadline to the 4th of July upon hearing that the Israelis are actually willing to negotiate, and they've sent a team to Paris to do this. And then also on day 5, the terrorists actually release 100 additional hostages. So we have 2 releases on day 4 with 48 hostages, and then on day 5 with an additional 100 hostages. And these people are people who are women, children, old people, people who are sick and frail, and so those are the people who've been selected. The first group of 48 was very kind of methodical and deliberate in terms of their methodology for selecting people, and by the time they release 100 of these hostages, it's a little bit less methodical in their kind of process. The other thing that's interesting is the president of Uganda, Idi Amin Dada. He's a military dictator. He's responsible ultimately for between 500,000 and 1 million deaths within his region there, within his country there. So he's a cruel, despotic military dictator. The Israeli government doesn't know at this point in time, is he in league with the terrorists, or what's kind of his status? And Idi Amin is trying to play both sides. When he talks with the Israeli government, he basically, and when he talks with the hostages, he actually appears about every day during this crisis to talk with the hostages in person. He basically says, I'm working to make your conditions, your living conditions better, and I'm working with the Israeli government to facilitate your release. But he also kind of sides with the terrorists and saying, hey, the Israeli government, is evil, and they've taken these innocent Palestinians and placed them in jail. So he's trying to kind of play all sides here. He's trying to be a friend of the hostages, a friend to Israel, and also a friend of the Palestinians. That's his public position on this. However, in reality, he's completely in league with the terrorists. The Israelis don't really realize this early on, but they come to realize this later. And so this is one of the big open question marks in terms of intelligence, in terms of the gap in their knowledge, is to what degree is Idi Amin supporting this? And the important part of that is the Ugandan military that's stationed outside the old terminal. What's their role? Are they there to just maintain order? Are they going to actively fight a potential hostage rescue mission? These are all open intelligence questions at this point in the crisis. Okay, next slide. So this is a picture of Idi Amin. He's a physically big guy. He's a boxer. He actually, the British, this was a colony, Uganda, from 1890 to 1962. So he was actually a sergeant in the British Army. He was a cook. Eventually he became a more senior officer. He rose to the rank of major. He's a very corrupt person within the Ugandan army after Ugandan independence. The president of Uganda was about to arrest him for corruption within the Ugandan military, and he actually stages a coup in 1971, and that's how he becomes the president of Uganda, is through a military coup against the president of Uganda at that time. So he shows up with this white cowboy hat. This is actually a photograph of him with the hostages in the old terminal building. He speaks English. Most of the passengers here, some of them speak English, most of them speak French, Hebrew. So they actually have to use translators to translate his English kind of pronouncements when he shows up into both French and Hebrew. So you see one of the individuals here with a bullhorn, and he's actually one of the translators, not an official translator, but he's actually one of the passengers that speaks either French or Hebrew. Next slide, please. So right here, these are the military options that the Israeli Defense Ministry under Shimon Peres actually considered. And so the first thing that the Army and the military comes up with is, like, why don't we just invade Uganda and we'll use 1,000 paratroopers? And so this is probably beyond the scope of the hostage rescue mission. So this is rejected somewhat out of hand, as probably being overkill, outside the scope, and not being realistic. So option 2 is, why don't we just take the airport with 300 to 400 airborne troops? And for the same reason, it's like, hey, this is probably not going to work because we don't know the status of the Ugandan forces, and we don't know if they're going to allow us to basically, refuel aircraft so we can actually make the trip back to Israel. So most of these initial types of options are not feasible because there's so much intelligence uncertainty in terms of, well, how are the Ugandans going to support us on, with our need to refuel to get back to Israel, our aircraft, or are they going to be a hostile force, and is this going to be a non-permissive environment? Option 3 is to amphibiously attack across Lake Victoria from Kenya. This is considered as an option, but it's not viable for those same reasons. We don't know to what degree the government of Uganda is going to allow this force to depart after this rescue mission occurs. And then the fourth option was to airdrop Zodiac boats into Lake Victoria, and then use paratroopers to basically navigate across Lake Victoria, these Zodiacs, and then launch this amphibious assault against the terminal, which is right on Lake Victoria. And so, same reason, that's discounted as well, just because of these uncertainties about, hey, is this going to be a permissive or non-permissive environment? This is, I think, really creative. Option 5 is, pretend that you're actually the freed Palestinian terrorists, dress up your commando force as the freed terrorists, put them on a marked up Air France Airbus, fly them down to Entebbe, and then launch a strike, an operation that way. And that has the same problems as all the other options. And then option 6 is to lure the terrorists and the hostages back to Israel for a counterterrorism raid at like the Lod airfield. And that would be somewhat akin to the 1972 Sabena Airlines hijacking. So they have experience doing that, but they kind of discount this one because they figure, hey, the terrorists probably aren't going to be stupid enough to actually fall for that. There's lots of great advantages to actually bringing the terrorists to Israel in terms of security, because then you do have a completely permissive environment that you can operate in. But that one's dismissed. And so finally, option 7 here is what they decide to do. And that's basically to air land an Israeli defense Force Special Operations Unit into the airfield at Entebbe, rescue the hostages, and then fly to Kenya for refueling, and then fly to Israel via Nairobi, Kenya, all the way back through the Red Sea to Israel. So they actually decide on option 7, and the kind of the tactical units that are involved in this from day one start planning this. So they've got about a 6-day lead or so on the planning of this, but the government of Israel doesn't actually decide to actually execute this mission until these aircraft are actually airborne. So they've got an airborne command and control link so they can actually give the mission a go. But the Israeli cabinet is meeting, and even before the cabinet meets, there's an 18-person cabinet. They actually have a special subcommittee of the cabinet, which they call the Israeli basically Defense and Foreign Policy Subcommittee of the Cabinet. So these different government bodies actually had to approve this mission, and they actually were airborne en route to Entebbe when these deliberations were occurring. Next slide, please. All right, so here's kind of the concept of operations for this mission. There's 4 C-130s. There's actually 5 initially that take out of the Lod airfield at Tel Aviv. They fly in 5 different directions just for operational security purposes, and they basically fly down to Israel's closest point of departure from Israel to Uganda, which is down at the very southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula in Sharm el-Sheikh. So that's where these aircraft are headed. They only need 4 C-130s to execute this, but they start off with 5 just so they have an operational spare before they leave Israel. They fly at super low levels when they depart out of Tel Aviv, like 100 feet or less. This is in the summertime. It's 100+ degrees across the Negev Desert, the Sinai. It's extremely rough flying, and even these commandos, as tough as they are, a lot of them get extreme air sickness to the extent that some of them actually have to be pulled off the mission just because of this extreme air sickness. You're just flying across Israel. They land down at Sharm el-Sheikh in the southern Sinai. They're on the ground, food, water, refueling the aircraft, and then these aircraft actually take off. And can you advance the slide set just once? We're going to come back here, but I think I've got a map here. So this is the route of flight. They basically take off, land at an Israeli airfield down in the southern Sinai, and then they have to make sure they're very careful about flying low-level missions, comms out, because they're trying to evade radar detection out of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and also Sudan. So they fly in international airspace through the Red Sea. They don't fly 4 ships in trail. It's 4 ships abreast so they can keep track of people. This mission is launched at about 15:30 Israeli time, so broad daylight, and they basically fly super low level over the Red Sea, comms out just to maintain operational security. When they get off the coast of Ethiopia, and we have Eritrea, that country didn't exist. This is actually Ethiopia, went all the way up to the Red Sea at that point. So they actually basically turn and head to the southwest, and their objective is to avoid the airspace of Djibouti, and then to basically fly clear across Ethiopia, right outside of Nairobi, Kenya, and then turn straight to the west and fly low level over Lake Victoria, and then land secretly at the Entebbe airport, which is just outside of Kampala, the capital of Uganda. Mike, could you go back one slide? Okay, great. So there's 4 aircraft that are involved in this operationally. The first aircraft is the key aircraft. The concept here is that they're basically going to bring in 2 Land Rover vehicles with commandos and 7.62 mounted machine guns, FN machine guns mounted on these Land Rovers, and also a stretched Mercedes-Benz black limousine with Ugandan flags. And the idea here is they're going to simulate Idi Amin showing up to the terminal to actually address the hostages. He's been doing this late at night, virtually every day during this hostage crisis. So they say to really maintain the element of surprise, we're going to basically dress up our initial entry team as Ugandan soldiers. So they basically get Ugandan military uniforms. They've got AK-47s. And they basically position 8 commandos inside this special presidential limousine, a Mercedes-Benz vehicle. So all of this is actually, all these vehicles are loaded onto the very first C-130, the 2 Land Rovers, and then the black Mercedes. So this is the main old terminal assault force. The idea here is from landing to actually killing all the terrorists. That's from landing to killing all the terrorists. A very brief time span of about 3 to 4 minutes is involved here. So this is a lightning fast. It relies on stealth. It relies heavily on deception and also speed and secrecy. And so the other team, they're on aircraft number 2. Their mission is to secure the perimeter of the old terminal and also to take over the control tower at the new terminal, and then basically surround the new terminal as well, that's the operational part of this airfield. There's also a blocking force that's involved in this operation because they don't want reinforcements to come down the key road, the airport road from the capital down into the Entebbe airfield. And then as part of the negotiations with Kenya, the Ugandans had actually purchased Soviet MiG aircraft. So there's 11 MiG-15s and they're MiG-17s and MiG-21s actually at the airfield. And the Kenyans said, hey, while you're there, do you mind destroying those MiG aircraft as kind of a secondary mission? And the Israelis say, of course we can do that. So part of this mission as a secondary mission is to destroy those aircraft. One, so they can't actually pursue these aircraft as they take off, and two, it's kind of just a gesture of kind of friendship that they've negotiated with the Kenyan government in Nairobi. So this is actually the composition. BTR-60s are used. That's Soviet military equipment that the Israelis captured during the Yom Kippur War. Instead of bringing their own like infantry fighting vehicles, these were fairly lightweight vehicles, and so they brought them just because they needed to make sure that they were within the parameters of the cargo capacity of a C-130. This first aircraft, number 1, the lead aircraft that landed, they also had some special paratroop forces that actually put down temporary runway lighting. They figured they could get the first aircraft in using the normal runway lighting, but then the Ugandans would actually turn off the aircraft runway lighting. So they actually had a team that was designed to actually put down a tactical temporary runway lighting system. And then the BTR-60s. This first aircraft was weighted at like 14.5 tons, and the aircraft, operational capacity was 12.5 tons. So when the aircraft commander took off in the Sinai, because of the heat and the overloading, he was about 2 knots above the stall speed. So this is a very daring mission right from the very beginning. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is actually not just one of the C-130s, but one that was actually involved in this operation. So this was taken at the end of the operation when they're back in Tel Aviv. So you get to see kind of the configuration in terms of camouflage. These C-130s were relatively new to the Israeli Air Force at this time, having acquired them in the early 1970s. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of these Israeli pilots certainly came to the United States for the training. This is a great airplane, the Lockheed Hercules C-130, really a key resource for this mission. Next slide. This right here is a photograph of the actual C-130 being loaded with the Mercedes-Benz vehicle. So even during the route, it's a 2,500-mile flight from the Sinai down to Entebbe, 4,000 kilometers. Everything is so tight in the C-130 that the special forces actually had to sit in the Mercedes and sit in the Land Rovers, and also in the BTR-60s, the infantry fighting vehicles that were on the other aircraft. And you can see the individual on the right, the soldier on the right, is actually not dressed up as an IDF member, but as a Ugandan. This is the camouflage pattern that the Ugandan military used. And they actually used AK-47s as far as weapons for the break-in team. Next slide. All right, so these are the missions for the aircraft number 3 and 4. After the first aircraft lands, the next aircraft lands 7 minutes later, and then aircraft 3 and 4 are 1 minute behind them. So in a very short order of time, 4 aircraft are on the ground here. Next slide. Actually, let me tell you about aircraft 4 quickly. So this is where the hostages are going to be transported back. So all the hostages are going to be placed on aircraft number 4. There's also a medical team that's actually going to take care of them because they're expecting a very high number of casualties here. The Prime Minister told his cabinet that if we have 25 dead or less, he'll consider this mission a success. So going right into this, they thought that, hey, this is going to be a very, very precarious mission in terms of potential loss of life and injury. So the Israelis thought about that in terms of medical support for this mission. Next slide, please. So this is just a layout here. So the aircraft land, they actually fly from east to west across the southern part, the central part of Lake Victoria. They land on the north-south new runway. They basically taxi up to the very end of the north-south runway, and then a lot of the aircraft are actually stationed on the ramp near the new terminal building. But the first aircraft actually stops at the very north end of the main runway, and that's basically where all of the 2 Land Rovers and the Mercedes are basically taken off the aircraft. And then they basically drive at 40 miles an hour, lights on. They're not trying to, they want to basically simulate that they're the presidential the president of Uganda, Idi Amin, and his party is showing up at the terminal. So their instructions are not to engage any of the Ugandan forces that are guarding the perimeter of the terminal, and to really simulate that they're just the presidential escort. So the concept here is they're going to come down to the old control tower, which you see here on the central part of the slide, and they're basically going to dismount their vehicles and then very quickly storm the old terminal building. They're somewhat lucky because the last 2 nights, the hostages have actually been in a lit room, so the terrorists have actually left the lights on overnight. So these folks land at 23:01 Zulu, which is midnight 01 on the 4th of July, Ugandan time. And within 3 or 4 minutes, they're actually storming the old terminal. This mission does not go to plan because the mission commander, Yanni Netanyahu, as they're approaching the old terminal building, there's Ugandans who issue a challenge sentries to this presidential convoy that's approaching the terminal. And so Yanni Netanyahu reaches for a Beretta 22 caliber silenced pistol and shoots those 2 soldiers. And then the other soldiers in his team in the Land Rovers say, okay, these soldiers actually survive this initial attack, and they open up with unsilenced weapons. So the element of surprise at this point is blown, and so that's going to be problematic. Next slide. Okay, this is a really interesting photograph. This is actually taken the day before this hostage rescue mission. This is actually the old terminal building. You see the main control tower here. There are Ugandan soldiers that are on the control tower. And then there's a perimeter of soldiers that are about 50 to 100 meters off the front of this facility. So you can see where these arrows are pointed. These are the main entries into the old terminal building. There's about a 3 to 4 foot high cinder block barrier here, a fence, and then a very tall cinder block barrier here. So the idea here is that this motorcade is going to pull up here, and they're going to dismount vehicles, storm this building, and then kill, all 7 of these terrorists in very quick order. There's the element of surprise is blown because about right here on this slide is where the sentries actually encountered the motorcade initially. Next slide. What's great about this photograph is this is actually taken by a Mossad operative the day before. The Mossad operative flies from Kenya in a very small light aircraft and actually takes that photography, lands the aircraft, actually goes into the terminal and has a conversation with the tower personnel. So there's a lot of great intelligence that's gained. Several hundred photographs on the ground and in the air, and then this very close interaction with the terminal personnel the day before this mission is launched. And those photographs are given to the crew, the IDF commando team, immediately on the flight down to Entebbe. So this right here is just a sketch. This is not an accurate depiction of the types of armored personnel carriers. These are 8-wheeled vehicles, the BTR-60s. But this is kind of the concept of operations. The big hall is where the majority of the terrorists are located, and also the passengers, the hostages. And then the small hall is previously where the Israelis were held. At this point in time, because there's been 148 hostages released, all the hostages are currently in the big hall. Several of the terrorists are actually guarding the hostages here in the big hall, and then there's 3 or 4 of them that are actually sleeping in a different part of the facility, like in the VIP room or in this room here, for example. Next slide. Okay, so these are the different types of weapons that are being used here. The FN, these are mounted machine guns on the 2 Land Rovers in the initial raiding party. And then they've got AK-47s, Galils, 5.56 millimeter Galils, and then the Berettas. For command and control, there's an airborne command post with a 707. General Adam, the director of operations for the IDF, and General Peled, the Israeli Air Force Chief of Staff, are in the airborne command post above the mission, and they're actually kind of the link between the government and military leaders in Tel Aviv with the folks on the ground. And then there's a field command post, Land Rover, 8 soldiers. That's near the new terminal building, kind of halfway between the new and the old terminals. In terms of logistics, they're either going to get fuel at Entebbe. They bring Air Force technicians to actually manually pump fuel for aircraft. They say there's a 60-minute time period that they've got max to do that. If they can't, then they're going to go to Nairobi. That's what they individually end up doing, actually. And then in terms of medical support, this is part of the agreement with Kenya. They fly a separate 707. They set up a field hospital and a field emergency room in a special section of the Nairobi airport. So as soon as these aircraft take off and fly across Lake Victoria, they immediately land in Nairobi, and that's actually where basically the casualties are being treated, the injured and the people who are dying, actually. Next slide, please. All right, this is just kind of a sequence of events. We've talked about this largely. We can probably move fairly quickly through this slide, but there's a big difference in speed, obviously, between the 707 command and control aircraft and obviously the medical medevac type 707. So there's a little bit of some time gaps in terms of takeoff and landing. They don't fly with the main four ship C-134, just because the C-130 is such a slow aircraft. But this is kind of the sequence of events in terms of the time as far as the takeoff. 12:30 Zulu is 15:30 local. Israel Z+3 and Uganda Z+1. Next slide, please. All right, so the raid on Entebbe, starts at just right after midnight. We talked about how this really went down. In terms of the actual raid itself, the raiding party is very successful in terms of very rapidly killing the terrorists. And what's unfortunate is one of the terrorists, one of the Palestinian terrorists, either the Peruvian or the terrorist in the yellow shirt is referred to, actually is at the very back left-hand side of the terminal. The two Germans are killed initially, both the man and the woman, and also the terrorist leader is killed within the first few seconds of the team actually entering the old terminal. There's a fourth terrorist that's in the back left of the room, and he actually lobs a smoke grenade from left to right across the terminal. And these basically, the people who are being held, the hostages, actually have a lot of bedding. They have mattresses and bedding on the ground. And this smoke grenade actually sets some of that bedding on fire and creates a fire and a lot of smoke in the terminal just within the first few seconds. So two of the hostages actually get up to actually move away from this burning part of the terminal. And unfortunately, the Israelis accidentally shoot. So there's definitely some casualties and some deaths that are caused not by the terrorists but by the Israeli party that's actually raiding the old terminal. Next slide, please. All right, so at the very end of the day, there's 102 hostages that are basically taken out of the terminal very quickly. They're boarded onto the fourth aircraft that's waiting right in front of the old terminal, and they actually take off. There's 6 injured here. The break-in commander is killed within the very first few minutes. This is Yoni Netanyahu, the older brother of the later Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the only IDF casualty in this attack, and he's actually killed by a sniper right off the bat within the first few seconds of this operation. The snipers were actually located on the tower of the old terminal. These are the hostages that were killed. You can see the first lady here was a Jewish immigrant to Israel from the Soviet Union. There's a French gentleman, 19 years old, that's killed in the attack. And then Pascal Cohen actually dies in surgery at a Nairobi hospital. So he's medevac out and dies later. And then Dora Bloch, this is very unfortunate. She's a 75-year-old woman who about 2 days before this raid was actually taken to the hospital in Kampala and was not at Entebbe during this raid. She had suffered from a choking incident with food, and the Minister of Health actually ordered that she be taken to the hospital in the capital. And so she was not there. She has joint Israeli-UK citizenship. The UK ambassador actually visits her, after this raid about 8 o'clock at night. They say, we're going to come back and bring you some food. And so the ambassador and his wife comes back, and by 9 o'clock, she's actually disappeared. So she was drugged, kicking and screaming from the hospital and then murdered and buried in a shallow grave outside of Kampala. So this is an unfortunate incident, and this is just revenge from Idi Amin because of this raid. Okay, next slide. All right, this is Yoni Netanyahu, who was killed. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was the on-scene commander for the break-in force, that part of this mission. Next slide. These are actually the hostages when they land back in Israel. They initially land at a military Air Force base outside of Tel Aviv. They actually are given food, water, kind of very briefly debriefed, and then they're flown to the Tel Aviv main civilian airport. And this is them getting off. The Israelis' radio had announced that this mission was successful while the aircraft were en route back, so that allowed time for a large group of civilians to welcome them back to Israel. So these are the hostages deboarding aircraft number 4. Next slide. This is certainly part of the air crew here, so a huge celebration. This is considered a very successful mission. Next slide. And in terms of kind of the case evaluation, the Ugandans, protested the UN Security Council, saying this was a violation of our sovereignty. The U.S., the French, the U.K., we threatened a veto, so this was simply a draft resolution that never really went forward. The U.S. reaction was President Ford sent a congratulatory note to the Prime Minister of Israel, and then, Secretary Kissinger, our Secretary of State, got involved and basically pre-positioned military forces, in Kenya or off the coast of Africa, just to preclude Amin from, launching a military intervention, a reprisal attack against the government of Kenya. Next slide. So the overall assessment is definitely this is a huge raid. This is a kind of a hallmark raid in terms of the history and kind of the lore of the Mossad and the Israeli Defense Forces. It was just an overarching success. Unfortunately, there were the deaths of the 4 hostages, and certainly the deaths of Benjamin Netanyahu's older brother, Yoni Netanyahu. But generally speaking, it's considered a very successful mission. This also taught Western governments that kind of the best response to terrorism was to not necessarily negotiate with terrorists, but to launch, when possible, military intervention to free hostages. The USA and the French, we both set up hostage rescue teams. This is somewhat of the impetus for the Delta Force that we have now out of Fort Bragg. The GSG-9, very famous counterterrorism force that was formed in response to the German debacle at the 1972 Olympics. In 1977, so just a year after this, went down to Mogadishu, Somalia, and had a very successful operational mission against terrorists there. And also this raid inspired the British SAS to actually launch a hostage rescue mission involving the Iranian embassy in London in 1980. So just to sum it up, this is a quote from Admiral Bill McRaven, Special Operations Force Commander. The best illustration of the theory of special operations yet presented. That's how he describes the raid on Entebbe. And then finally, the British historian Max Hastings also has high praise for this, as you can see by his quote as well. Next slide. These are some good sources if you're interested in learning more about this. The best book I found on this was a 2015 Operation Thunderbolt book. And I've got a few of these books at the back of the classroom here. You can see, so Operation Thunderbolt is a really great book. There's also a famous book, 90 Minutes at Entebbe. That was the first book that came out on this in 1977. So a whole series of really great books if you're interested in learning more about the details of this specific operation. Okay, that concludes the presentation. And we've got about 12 minutes or so for question and answer. So I appreciate your attention. You've been very patient. So any questions or discussion you might have? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so you discussed the revolutionary cells in the PLFP.
Right.
And I guess I'm just curious as to, so you said the revolutionary cells are sympathetic to the Palestinians.
Right.
But just that sympathy alone was enough for them to, engage in this hijacking with them? Or
largely. So that's the main kind of reasoning. There's a secondary reason as well. So the main reasoning is these are a lot of these Palestinian groups at this point in time. They are certainly their overarching goal is certainly the idea that they want to establish a Palestinian homeland in the territory of Israel, and they're really dedicated to the destruction of Israel. I mean, this position has evolved over time, but in this period of the 1970s, it was a very militant type position. But there were a lot of Palestinian leaders, especially the senior leadership of the Palestinian movement. Some of these were actually Palestinian Arab Christians, and they actually were very left-leaning, so they had a Marxist ideology. So it wasn't a kind of a fundamentalist jihadist type of ideology at this point. And because of that Marxist left-leaning kind of political ideology in the Palestinian movement, that actually attracted a lot of support from Western European left-leaning communist terrorist groups. So from a purely ideological standpoint, they had similarities. In terms of the revolutionary cells here, that was a small group of terrorists, but they also had sympathies with the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Red Army faction within Germany. And so there were 4 or 5 very senior level Red Army faction terrorists, and those were 5 of the terrorists actually that were on the list beyond the 40. There were 13 other terrorists, and so 5 of them were German terrorists, the Baader-Meinhof gang, so Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof, they were actually on the list. So that was kind of the secondary mission for the revolutionary cells, is they wanted people not from their organization but had ideological similarities to their organization. They wanted those folks released from West German prisons. So that was kind of their part of the demands as well, in terms of hostages being, the terrorists being released from German jails. So hopefully that helps a little bit. So it's interesting, kind of just how how the kind of the changing face of terrorism. You know, today we see Islamic fundamentalism really driving this. At this point in time, these Palestinian terrorists were motivated by a grievance against Israel because they'd been displaced from their lands in Palestine initially in 1948, and then that was further exacerbated in the 1967 war. So a lot of these hostages grew up in refugee camps, abject poverty. And I'm not trying to make excuses, but those were the conditions that they were raised in, and that bred a lot of hostility and hatred towards Israel. And so that was a prime motivation for the Palestinians. All right. Yeah, please. Yes, sure. Any other questions? Yeah, please. Yes, sir.
It's not much of a question, but it's interesting to see how it went from a large-scale operation, and then as it digressed, each phase within the first 3 days was shaping operations, and as they got more cool from the 3 days of the shaping operations, that's when they started to actually utilize the option 7, which was a combination of 3, the amphibious, assault companion, 5, the fly commandos, and 6, the luring of the hostages and counter terrorists. Because when you showed them the picture of the actual Mercedes,
right,
it was option 1 and 2 were out, but
right,
they utilized the next 3 that were actually the best fit. And as you continue to move down forward, the actual operation itself didn't actually quite get into effect until you got to Operation Thunderbolt, and then once you got to Lieutenant Colonel, what was it?
Yeah, Netanyahu.
Yep. Once his death came on the factors within Operation Thunderbolt, it took a whole turning point at the whole turn.
That's right. And the great thing about the Israeli defense minister at this time, as these plans, these options were being presented, he knew that, hey, this is going to be largely hinging upon the element of surprise and speed, because there was also fear that the terrorists might have ringed the entire interior rooms with explosives. So the terrorists actually had placed cardboard boxes and wires and things like that. And what the Mossad did, and this was brilliant, they gained a lot of intelligence by interviewing hostages that were released in Paris. So there was a Mossad team in Paris, and so those first 2 batches of hostages that were released, the Mossad interviewed those folks to gain intelligence about a lot of key things to help plan this mission. But part of that was because, one of the questions was, are the Ugandans going to offer a hostile or permissive environment? Are we going to be able to refuel in Uganda or not? And then they had to devise an operation by which they could actually very quickly storm the terminal, because they were very fearful that within seconds, between small arms fire, hand grenades, and then basically the explosives that possibly could have been rigged in the terminal, that within seconds all of these hostages could be killed. And so that also helped kind of whittle down the options as well. But you've done a great job of capturing how certainly the planning and the concept of operation evolved over time. And even the military was skeptical until almost the very end. I mean, it took them a long time. They worked many, many days, 5 or 6 days, before they finally settled on that option number 7. And the Prime Minister was initially very skeptical, based on his military background, that any of this was going to work. But finally, they actually did a scale mock-up test of this, a practice, and they were convinced, the military was convinced that, hey, this has a pretty good chance of success. And that's how the Director of Operations for the IDF briefed it to the Cabinet and the Prime Minister. But I think you did a great job of encapsulating just how the plan evolved, from a very high-end type of concept of operations to a much more tailored, high-speed, element of surprise, deception type of operation that they employed at the end. Right, other thoughts, questions? I think we're probably right on, getting close. We still have 5 minutes, so. Anything in the chat in terms of questions? Good. Not yet? Okay. Well, if there's no further questions or comments or anything, I appreciate it. It's been a privilege to spend time with you. It's great to be here to represent the University of Oklahoma, and I want to thank Mike and Anita. They've always been tremendous leaders here at the Education Center, bringing all kinds of great educational opportunities to the soldiers here at Fort Sill and civilians. So I can't thank you enough for the kind invitation, so thank you. Thanks, everybody.